The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Today marks the 100th episode of EconVersations. So thanks for joining us all these years. Perhaps the least understood part of the work of economics professors is the research that we conduct. Economists, as well as professors in other disciplines, undertake research to help us better understand the world we live in, or at least the parts of it related to our own particular disciplines. And yet the contribution of the research conducted by economists can be hard to understand, leading some critics to suggest that faculty research is really the culprit behind the rising cost of higher education. We've done a number of episodes of EconVersations focusing on the research of our Johnson Center scholars and also visitors that we've had into the Johnson Center. But today we're going to talk about why ideas matter, and therefore why the ideas contributed by economists also matter. To do this, I've invited on 4 of my colleagues from the Johnson Center to share with us some of the examples that they've seen from economics research that they believe shows how economics research is affecting public policy, and by extension, our lives are today. To start us off today, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Steve Miller, the Executive Director of the Johnson Center, and Dr. Dan Smith, the Associate Director of the Johnson Center. Welcome to EconVersations number 100.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks.
So before we get into the examples of that you've selected to show how economics affects our daily lives, we want to talk a little bit more broadly about this general proposition about the role of ideas in society, and then particularly the role of economics research. And if we start with it, I think it could certainly excuse the average person if they looked at some of the economics research out here, and there's just some things to show, some of the exciting article titles, and then what some of this economics research looks like. If people look at stuff like this and say, like, well, that looks all like Greek or math to me, and how can anything so abstract and so complex and so disconnected from the world actually affect the world around us? I think they could certainly understand some of their skepticism there, right?
Yes.
And yet, if we think about it, because ideas matter in society, we can also see that economics research is going to matter as well, right?
Yes, we definitely have seen places where it matters a lot.
And I think there's some reasons why we can see this that occur here. And one of them comes from an old economics story about the fable of the broken window. If one of you could just tell us a little bit about this fable.
Yeah, so the broken window fallacy is something that goes all the way back to a French economist, Bastiat. And he made an argument that, so people oftentimes made an argument that we have a war, we have a natural disaster, something breaks houses, it destroys resources that we already have. And Bastiat analogized this to breaking a window. And people oftentimes argued, well, we've had this destruction, and now it's going to create a job because now we have to fix that. We have to build new houses. Mm-hmm. We have to rebuild the window. What Bastiat observed and tried to convey to the general public is actually when you break a window, you're not actually creating a new job. If I didn't have to fix my window, I would have bought something else. I would have bought a new suit. I would have bought a car. It's something else that we would have spent money on and created a job producing something that we didn't have. So actually, when you destroy resources like break a window, you actually destroy wealth in society, and then we have to take resources to rebuild what we already have. We're much better off if instead the window was never broken in the first place.
And really then we can sort of see that the role of economists is I guess people like Bastiat or Henry Hazlitt and others since then have made, is to sort of make sure we systematically trace out and make sure we can see what is unseen otherwise. That we can make sure we understand what would be going on if not for the construction to rebuild the damage after the hurricane or the natural disaster, right?
That's right. I mean, what
is what is seen, Bastiat pointed out, is yes, you see that there was a window broken and now there's a glazier employed to fix it. What is unseen in that scenario is what else could have been done with those same resources.
And since we don't actually get to observe what was unseen, I mean, economists have to have some discipline to make sure that what we are projecting as the possible unseen actually sort of makes sense. I mean, some internal consistency or logic, and that's really one way to think about economic theory, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. It's kind of like going to a physician, right? You go to a physician and they say, you tell them, I'm feeling fine. Well, you pay the physician to look a little deeper, look at the unseen. And that's what professional economists are doing, is we're trying to train people to understand, we can look at overall the big picture of the economy, but what's happening unseen? What would have happened? What are the consequences? What are the unintended consequences? So it's that professional perspective that tries to shine a light on those areas that most lay people commonly don't look at.
The next thing to point out is a quote from a famous economist, John Maynard Keynes, who's maybe some of his research conclusions we might not completely agree with, but he had this tremendous quote about the role of the importance of economic ideas in society. I think all economists learned this quote early on in their training, right? And it really reflects the question that the simple agenda of public policy, what we think is or isn't possible, is being shaped by ideas, right?
Yes. I mean, that's the idea, is that intellectual conversations and intellectual exchange actually does have an impact on what people view as possible in the policy arena. And sometimes it is merely justifying what happens in public policy, but other times it actually it opens the conversation. And so it definitely has a large impact. And Keynes was a shrewd observer of that, and that was part of the reason why he thought working on macroeconomic issues was so important.
And then finally, the economists at the Johnson Center, we are all big believers in what's known as a spontaneous order in the economy. But if you're a theorist or a believer of spontaneous order, I think it's also particularly important that we make sure we understand what's going on, because there's an order here in everyday life, in the economy or in society, that we might not otherwise, if you didn't actually systematically study the economy, be aware of, right?
Yeah, it is an absolute miracle when you really think about it, that juice shows up on our grocery store shelves, that food shows up at restaurants, let alone big things like a 787 get manufactured. The millions of people involved in the manufacturing of all these goods, the people that mine the ore and metal used in these products, the people that build the trucks that ship these products, and the boats, the people that make the coffee for the people that are captaining the boat. Before you know it, millions of people around the world themselves, who don't realize what all the things that they're involved in manufacturing, are involved in the manufacturing of all the products we consume on a daily basis. And it's that appreciation for that spontaneous order going on in the economy that economists really stress. And James Buchanan actually said it's the first and foremost responsibility of economists is to demonstrate to people that the economy is like this giant erector set up in a mansion, and anytime an outsider, like a government official, tries to intervene, there can be all sorts of unintended consequences, because it's hard to know, anytime you make a little adjustment here or there in the economy, how many millions of people might be affected around the economy, the rest of the economy.
Well, with this background here, everyone's turned out to the examples, and our guests today have all picked out one example from either recent or somewhat distant economic past of how some research has affected public policy. And Steve, we'll start with you here today. Okay. And so why don't you tell us what you've picked out?
So I picked out an example on minimum wage research, and this kind of changed the way people, economists especially, were looking at the minimum wage. In public policy debates, it seems like focus on the discussion around the minimum wage is always focused on whether it should be higher or not, not whether it should exist or anything like that, and certainly not whether there are any unintended consequences. So Card and Kruger, David Card and Alan Kruger, are two Princeton labor economists, and they wanted to look into the kind of common economic reasoning that goes into a discussion of the minimum wage, which is there an unintended consequence of raising the minimum wage? Does it create a disemployment effect? In other words, do people end up with are there fewer jobs available as a result of raising the minimum wage? And the concept is very simple, that the demand for labor slopes downward, and if the price of labor is higher, the wages are higher, then employers aren't going to employ as many people. So they set out to test that. And their research was hugely influential because they looked at a minimum wage increase in New Jersey, and they compared areas of southern New Jersey to Pennsylvania along the border. And what they discovered was essentially there was no impact of an increase in the minimum wage in the early 1990s on New Jersey's low-wage labor market.
Oh.
And
that would seem to be surprising compared to what we normally teach in principles, right?
it would be. And of course, because this finding kind of ran in the face of supply and demand economics, standard classical economics, it was seen as a victory for people who believed that the minimum wage could be raised and could be raised substantially without having adverse effects on the labor market. So there's some very interesting things that went into this study. One is it was technically sophisticated. So the authors used, at the time, relatively advanced econometric techniques to kind of go through the data and work through and isolate what they saw as the important things that were affecting wages. What I find interesting about this episode is that it was a bit of a triumph of technique over substance, because the actual data that they used, where they had graduate students and others at Princeton University call fast food restaurants, KFC, Roy Rogers, restaurants like that, call fast food restaurants and ask the managers if they had employed more or fewer people over the past year. So it was based on phone survey participation and just asking managers of fast food restaurants whether or not they have hired more or fewer people in the past year, or whether they've laid anyone off as a result of a minimum wage increase. And that's very hard to get an unbiased sample. There's reasons to think why managers might not want to admit to doing that. But then there's also all kinds of discussions about mechanisms. And you would want to look more closely at actual payroll data and things like that to determine whether there was an effect. So David Newmark is an economist who tried to replicate their results by looking at payroll data rather than the phone survey data. And what he found was that there were actually modest reductions in job opportunities and decreases in employment in the fast food industries when you look at the payroll data. So he found essentially a moderate finding, but the opposite of what Card and Kruger found. There's another thing that sticks out to me, though, here, which is kind of the way economists think and the way we love to think about percentages rather than absolute numbers. So the minimum wage in New Jersey at this time in the early 90s, it increased from $4.25 an hour to $5.05 an hour. So from $4.25 to $5.05. That's a significant increase. It's 19%. It's 80 cents, right? But when you think about what that means to actual minimum wage workers, even if you were working full time, that's less than $30 a year after your FICA or $30 a week after your FICA withholding, and most of them are, of course, part-time. So we're talking a matter of, for a lot of workers, a few dollars a week, which doesn't have a big impact on their life or lifestyle. So it seems like a significant increase in the minimum wage, but sometimes absolute numbers matter, and it's not just percentages that matter. So it's very interesting. One thing I did was several years ago now, or a few years ago, I looked at minimum wage changes in Washington state, where they were much larger. They went from about $7 an hour up to $10 an hour, and I compared that with border counties in Idaho. And I found what Newmark found in terms of employment trends, which was that in the service sectors, low-paid service sectors, you saw increases in unemployment that coincided with those minimum wage increases.
Oh, well, thanks very much. Dan, I'm going to turn to your, tell us a little bit about your example that you've picked out for us.
Yeah, so I selected the Federal Reserve, and in my opinion, for better or worse, I think the Federal Reserve is one of the examples of public policy where economists have perhaps had the most influence on public policy, both in the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913 and various restructuring the Federal Reserve in 1954, but also in day-to-day policy and in academic research having policy-relevant implications. So if you look at so in total, the Federal Reserve employs most self-identified monetary economists. They work at the Federal Reserve or receive research grants through the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve actually hires directly these economists. They work with academic economists. They Federal Reserve economists are in control of, are on the editorial board of several academic journals. So they're prevalent throughout the profession, and there's a strong integration between monetary economists and actual policy and policy research done at the Federal Reserve.
And so how would this be affecting our perception of policy and I guess whether we need the Federal Reserve or not, right?
Yeah, so given that there's a strong consensus in the academic profession that the Federal Reserve is necessary and that we can, by fine-tuning our economic models, by gathering data better or in new modern ways, that we can provide the optimal currency through the Federal Reserve, it adds justification to the public that, oh, the Federal Reserve is necessary. And I know this very well because a lot of my research actually criticizes the Federal Reserve. It questions whether we actually even need the Federal Reserve, or if rather we should return to a gold standard or another alternative mechanism besides having a centralized monetary standard through the Federal Reserve. And convincing the public is very hard on these issues, given that there's such a strong consensus by monetary economists.
And this would be a case where then if you did try to bring up the whole idea of doing something to reform the Federal Reserve, it might be dismissed as crazy or completely out of the realm of possibilities, just because we've been told by so many economists over the years that nations have to have central banks to manage their currency, right?
Absolutely, and that's certainly even research published in top journals criticizing the Federal Reserve is oftentimes dismissed as, oh, that's not the standard consensus in the profession. So we still get the Federal Reserve and still have many monetary economists working for the Federal Reserve, and in the near future I don't see that changing, precisely because so many economists support the Federal Reserve. In fact, are employed even at the top of the Federal Reserve. If you look through the chairman of the Federal Reserve, it's been academic economists serving in those roles, and that lends credibility to the institution.
And it certainly creates the impression that you have a bunch of expert economists there, and that monetary policy has to be dealt with by these experts, right?
Absolutely, and it conveys that we as academic economists feel that we have the knowledge required to conduct monetary policy, as well as the incentives. We have the aligned incentives to make sure that we aren't pressured by politics to deliver suboptimal monetary policy in order to serve political aims.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks again to both of you for sharing these examples with us. We'll be right back with more EconVersations after this break. Well, welcome back. And now I've been joined by two more of my colleagues from the Johnson Center, Dr. John Dove and Dr. Dave Hebert. Gentlemen, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having us.
back.
Welcome to EconVersations number 100. So, as we've been talking today on EconVersations episode number 100, we're talking about some examples of how it is that the research of economists have affected public policy and, by implication, our everyday lives. And so, John, we're going to turn to you next for an example from antitrust policy. So, if you could very briefly just explain antitrust policy and its history, and then get into the contribution you want to talk about.
Sure, yeah. Federal antitrust policy really began in 1980 or 1890 with the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was meant to break up trusts in large corporations and to avoid potential monopolization of an industry. And that's something that really persisted for a long period of time with various changes in the statutes and has ultimately been interpreted in courts in various ways over time.
And So then tell us a little bit about the change that has occurred with the antitrust laws and how it resulted from the research of economists.
Yeah, so I think the major change that we really saw was, during the 1950s and 60s, courts had really taken many of these antitrust laws and simply applied it to anything that could have potentially lead to bigness in an industry, any sort of market concentration at all, to the point that even a merger between two firms that led to a 4% market concentration was deemed inappropriate and illegal by the courts. Well, really what we saw in the 1970s and 1980s, especially coming from the University of Chicago, their economics department and also the law school there, was an understanding of the actual economic implications of things like mergers and how this applied to antitrust policy, understanding that actually in many ways when you have firms that want to merge or become larger, it can be for a multitude of beneficial reasons to consumers. Some of the biggest ones being that you can reduce costs by increasing the size of your firm. So we see that there's a better understanding of how that process works and how that translates into actually lower prices for consumers. That's one of the big ones. Some of the other ones too that we see is things like predatory pricing. There's actually, and this is something that persists even to today, where this idea that somehow a firm could undercut its competition's price, drive it out of the market, and then increase price and start charging monopoly prices is something that actually was seen as really being impossible to do. I know that we've talked about that previously on an episode, but a number of issues like this.
And there are other elements of other specific kinds of provisions that the antitrust laws were prohibiting or making it hard for businesses to do because they were thought to be anti-competitive, but actually could be in reasonable ways for businesses to try to structure their organization to try to reduce and control transactions costs, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that's a huge component to this, is trying to find ways to, again, think about ways to merge with other firms or to restructure their overall business in a way that they can ultimately drive down the costs that they face, which ultimately translates into lower prices for consumers. Again, thinking about what we call in economics economies of scale, looking at average total costs, things like that, and understanding that through larger production, you can actually drive down those costs, and in many ways that ultimately leads to lower prices for consumers, which was something really prior until this revolution in the 1980s. Courts didn't really have any conception of, and the way that antitrust had been applied was, again, any sort of bigness at all was really just per se illegal.
And furthermore, we also understood as economists that there were ways in which you could have quite a bit of competition even with a small number of firms in a marketplace, right?
That's exactly right. And even situations, and this is something that antitrust regulators understand today, where you could have situations where you have no actual physical competitors in a market, but it's still a competitive market, right? And so that's what we call a contestable market, where really the threat of competition is competition, where you have a situation where as long as barriers to entry are low, even one firm in a market probably is charging the lowest price that it can possibly charge, because if it tried to raise that price, competitors would actually enter that market. And again, that was something that really wasn't well understood until this revolution that we saw in the late 70s and early 80s.
And so this has definitely affected our lives in terms of allowing certain mergers to occur or certain businesses to engage in certain practices that they would have been prohibited from before, right?
That's exactly right. Significant changes along those lines, and something that's very important and persists even to today is that antitrust regulators really do look much more toward, the efficiency behind the issue, and consider whether or not this is going to be something that's economically efficient. In other words, is it going to drive resources to higher valued uses? Is it going to ultimately lead to lower prices for consumers? And understanding that even this conception of bigness, right? A large firm actually can and is, in many instances, quite good at achieving that outcome.
Well, thanks, John. And Dave, why don't you tell us about the example you've picked out for us?
Yeah, so I picked the work of Al Roth and Lloyd Shapley, who won the Nobel Prize in 2012 for their work on organ markets. And so what these two gentlemen found was a severe shortage, we would call it, in the kidney market. So there were a lot of people that wanted new kidneys, that needed new kidneys, and not very many people willing to sort of donate them. And prior to their work, the only way that a person that needed a kidney could get one is if someone happened to die close by, and they happened to die in a very specific way that kept their organs fresh and viable for a long enough time to actually be transplanted. And so there, only about 1% of all deaths were even possibly able to be transplants. But even then, you had to factor in blood types, you had to factor in antigens and all kinds of other things. So these people would quite literally be waiting on their deathbeds, hoping that someone else would die so that they could have a kidney. And what Al Roth and Lloyd Shapley worked on was essentially a way to match different pairs of people who had a willing donor and a necessary recipient, but perhaps they just weren't quite the perfect match for each other. This program, or this algorithm they invented, basically allowed them to match different donor pairs with different people and increase the number of viable kidney transplants that could happen.
So if you could elaborate on this a little bit, because it seems really sort of amazing and not the kind of thing that you'd think that an economist would have something to be able to contribute. It sounds like a medical issue.
Right, it is a medical issue, and they found it by looking at medicine. And so the idea is, let's say I go into renal failure and I need a new kidney, and you, being an excellent colleague, say, oh, Dave, I love having you as a colleague. Here, you can have one of my kidneys. Well, your kidney's only going to work in my body if we happen to be the right blood type and we have the right level of antigens, or the right type of antigens. If you don't, even though you're willing to give me a kidney, I couldn't accept it because it would die too quickly in my body to be of any value. And so the idea is that there could be another pair of people who are in a similar predicament out there, where someone would love to donate a kidney to a family member or a friend, but they're the wrong blood type too. But maybe they're the right blood type for me, and you're the right blood type for them, or for their recipient. And so what happens is you would give your kidney to their recipient, and they would give their kidney to me. And so the great thing about this is, prior to the real adoption of this in about the year 2002, in the year 2000 there were 2 kidneys that were transplanted through this method. Today, or at least last year when we have the most data, there were over 700. And so there are hundreds of people that are alive today that would not be alive if it were not for the work of Al Roth.
Well, that sounds an amazing way in which it's really literally life and death issues. It's saving lives.
Right. I mean, so most people make a joke and say things like, if all the economists in the world disappeared, the world would still look exactly as it does. But if the garbage men disappeared, it'd be a much different world. I think today what we've highlighted are 4 examples of situations where economists have objectively made the world a much better place.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think another great example. I think hopefully these have been some cases that have been able to allow you to see how it is that the scribblings of us academic economists, which might seem quite unconnected from the world, are really are shaping and hopefully sometimes improving, but not always improving. But for better or worse, our scribblings are affecting the world around you in your lives as well. Well, this has been 100 episodes of EconVersations, and we want to pause and recognize this, and we want to also welcome you back and hope you will join us again next time as we start the second 100 episodes of EconVersations. Thank you.